I want you to take a moment to think of what comes to mind when you see this word. This is Mutia al-Haffar, a Syrian refugee who lives in Connecticut. When she went through the worst experience of her life, journalists parachuted in and took photos of her children who suffered permanent injuries of an explosion that took away their home. Even after she came to the US, journalists came to take photos of her children and write about the explosion. This happened many times, and she never heard back from any of the journalists again. My name is Rawan Yaghi. I created Tahaddi, or Challenge in Arabic, to engage with Arabic-speaking refugee mothers in the US. I was born a refugee to parents who were also born refugees in Gaza, Palestine. I've seen foreign journalists come in when the death toll rises and leave when the dust settles on the rubble. Stories about refugees are often carry a tone of tragedy and victimhood. The stories which are eventually told are done so through mediated experiences, i.e., the voices of journalists. We rarely get to hear from Mutia herself or from her children. We don't ever hear the stories that she really wants to tell. My journey has taught me that journalism can be empathetic, engaging, and impactful. I started by listening, which took 5 forms. The majority of the input for Tahaddi came from interviews. These also helped me write an ethnography of the community that helped me build a more nuanced view of its culture. I also read a lot of academic papers and interviewed academics who write about culture, who write about refugees, resettlement, globalization, and colonization. I initiated a writing workshop with refugee women in the US and Sweden in collaboration with Neighbors to Refugees, a community-led organization in New York. Then I invited 3 Syrian mothers to attend regular Zoom meetings. This helped me identify gaps regarding raising children in a new culture and the anxiety of not just generational gaps, but also a conflict of boundaries between parent and child when it comes to what can be accepted from the new culture. This is also tied into how the mothers represent themselves and what kind of stories they want to pass down to their children. Engagement means being guided by the community rather than enforcing my own ideas about what they need. The main form it took is the Zoom meetings. And this is where women were most vulnerable and shared opinions freely. But it's also where I shared my own vulnerabilities and my personal stories with them, which I think went a long way in opening conversations and showing trust. Listening to my experiences allowed them to share their stories of refuge and displacement. Second, we have the Facebook group, which was moderated, safe, private, and provided opportunities for sharing experiences, answering and asking questions, and which was created to expand our small Zoom community. Third, the photo project provided an immensely rewarding experience for the community members involved. For once, they were their own storytellers, and they had all control over how they were perceived visually and which stories they wanted to tell. My role there was purely editorial, and I only provided technical guidance and opened conversations about the symbolism of self-portraits. The outcome was a 3-part series of first-person narrated stories by refugee mothers who talked about the stories behind objects that they chose to take photos of. This is still being edited, and it will be up on my website soon. To address information needs, I took questions that came up during my listening exercises and researched them, talked to academics, and sometimes aggregated information about the topic and put it in the form of infographics. These were all shared on the Facebook group. The challenges I faced were mainly due to the sensitivity of the topics we discussed. which in turn presented a trust challenge, which was mainly visible on Facebook. Metrics is where my work with Slate's audience development team came in handy. In addition to the quality of discussion and comments, I looked at the engagement rate on Facebook. Though this didn't reach my goal, having an average of 30% of the people engage with the majority of the posts was a good start for the first 2 months. And from a debriefing session with the direct participants, I now know that this is another manifestation of the lack of trust, not just in me as a journalist, but between the group members themselves. However, I'm still testing different social strategies to increase trust and engagement. I was able to reach 19 mothers on Facebook. I kept testing out different approaches to growth, like sending invitations to community-led organizations, which didn't really give any results. But I had some success when participants invited their friends on Facebook. This also helped me adjust my growth strategy. And this, again, tells us a lot about the trust and the spaces this community is comfortable existing in. The project opened really sensitive discussions like child sexuality, queerness, identity, language, and even the oppression of Kurdish minorities in Syria. One of the participants said that a lot of mothers are too embarrassed to talk about these issues with their children, let alone with anyone else. It built a community, which, though small, effectively built the trust that was lacking elsewhere. And it allowed the women to process and reflect on their own stories and experiences. Mutia, who made these images, told me and the other participants on the Zoom call the story behind her Syrian passport, how somebody promised to fly her and her kids out to Germany, how once she was in Turkey, that promise could not be fulfilled. She talked about how terrifying that experience was, to be alone in a strange country. But she also talked about how she worked there in order to put food on the table for her children. Later, Mutia said that telling the story felt like a get it off your chest session. Finally, what are your takeaways from this? In order to do impactful journalism, you need to put your community at the heart of your journalistic process. Listening and engaging with the community are ongoing processes that feed into each other and which inform the service you want to provide to that community. Once you provide a service that is based on your community's needs, you will notice impact. All of these processes are a constant give and take between you and your community. Give and take to build trust, to learn, and to impact. Thank you.